Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could join us this evening. Welcome to our evening presentation on Living Earth and the Life Beneath Our Feet with the Canadian Wildlife Federation and our super special guest, Vivian Kaloxilos. I'm going to say that again, Kaloxilos. I really am determined to say that right. So people are still joining. That's great. As you're joining, you are very welcome in the chat to say where you're from. And remember, when you click the chat, you can choose to everyone or just to the host and panelists. So it's kind of nice if you're comfortable to choose everyone, then we can kind of see where we're tuning in from this country, far and wide. I am Sarah Colbert. I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. I'm with the Gardening for Wildlife program, and I personally am in the country a little bit west of Ottawa. So all right, people are saying where they're from. Let's see here. Kelowna, Cookstown, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Cherry Valley, Ontario. I know someone who lives there. New Brunswick, Regina, snowy Regina. We had snow today after having 30-degree weather a couple of days ago. Crazy. Oh, this is wonderful. Corey is from Almont, from Peru. Wow, awesome. Chatham, Toronto. It's going so fast. I can't keep up with them all, but that's great. Thank you very much, everyone, for sharing. That's lovely. So what I'm going to do is just get on with the housekeeping for tonight. If you have any comments, please put them in the chat. But if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A, because at the end of Vivian's presentation, I will then go just to the Q&A and read them out, and we'll get through as many as we can this evening. And this talk will be recorded, so don't worry about taking a bazillion notes. There will be a replay link sent to you in a follow-up email a number of days after this this recording, or this event rather. What else do I need to say? People are still joining in, so that's super, but I'm going to stay on time and continue on. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and that I respect the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous people across this land. And with all of my webinars, because I'm with the Gardening for Wildlife program, I like to say that it's really a nice tie-in with what we're about and what we're all trying to do. Because the Indigenous people, you know, for eons, they're known for respecting the land and nature, only taking what they need, giving back, the wise stewardship. And this talk is like every other one we have, doing that exact same thing in our corners of the country. So that's wonderful. So let's see here. I think that's all for housekeeping and for starting things off. I'm going to hand it over to our guest once I introduce her. So Vivian is an ecologist specializing in soil ecology and applied soil life regeneration, and is the founder of DocTerre, a company that supports farmers and landowners in regenerating soil biodiversity. Vivian is also a master compost maker, providing compost inoculums that are ecologically balanced and biologically rich, which her clients use to make liquid compost extracts on their farm. Before founding DocTerre, she taught and mentored Dr. Lane Ingham's soil consultants around the globe, was a graduate of McGill's School of Environment and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Applied Field Ecology, and completed her permaculture design certificate. And in fact, it was by listening to Dr. Elaine Ingham that I learned about this really cool, well, these other elements to this cool topic. I thought I knew a fair bit about soil and microorganisms, but there's so much more exciting stuff to know. And I was delighted that Vivian learned there, taught there, and can share wonderful wisdom with us about this. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Vivian. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Yes, thank you.
And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Okay, cool. I'm getting myself organized over here. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So thank you, Sarah, for having me with you today. I'm just going to start my timer, because when I start talking, sometimes I just lose track of time. Don't stop. I'm going to put my timer on here. All right. So I'm really happy to be here today because, well, normally I'm talking and teaching about this in the context of agriculture. And today we're talking in the context of gardening, and also in the context of just supporting wildlife and biodiversity. So it's very exciting to me to be here talking about living soils, because it's, whoops, here we go. It's really surprising to me. We live on planet Earth, and it's very few of us understand what the Earth is and what soil is and how it works. And this planet is a living, breathing entity in and of itself, with living, breathing soils. And the state of its health will very much determine the state of health and biodiversity of everything else living on the planet. Healthy soils, we tend to walk around and not even think about what the earth is doing for us and our communities and society on a day-to-day basis. But aside from being a surface to walk on, the healthy soils are providing many, many services. So here, when I talk about here's my computer, guys, skipping way ahead because I have a computer that has a mind of its own. When I talk about resource cycling, it's in nature, plants feed themselves, because nobody is out there applying fertilizers or anything to a native ecosystem, a wild ecosystem, to help the plants grow. And there aren't piles and piles of plant matter, organic matter on the surface of the earth. Things are cycled. So this nutrient cycling, the way that resources are decomposed and then recycled to feed the plants and the whole web of life, this cycling and process between life and death and life again, this is a service of a healthy living soil. They keep ecosystems healthy and clean. They purify the water that comes through. So a healthy soil will be cleaning the water as it moves through the soil's body, so that we end up with clean drinking water, and that our lakes and rivers and water bodies are also clean. When we talk about water dead zones, aside from people just dumping chemical wastes into water, these are actually a factor of soils not being healthy anymore, not providing this filtration of water moving through it. So that is a service and a function of healthy soils. And without clean water, there's no life. So it's such a fundamental part of how everything functions on this planet. Obviously, the earth is a structure for life. So everything we see and know lives on the earth, but it is also an ecosystem in and of itself. And as I will be talking about more today, this ecosystem in the soil is very, very much dependent on the ecosystem above the ground. And the biodiversity and wildlife above the ground is also very dependent on the life in the soil. Everything's very interconnected. It will impact the health of the atmosphere. There's a whole ecosystem in the clouds that help to create drops of rain. There's so many things that are happening that we don't see, and it starts from the earth and it moves on up. Healthy living soils are also responsible for the way water moves and is managed through an ecosystem. So healthy landscape will be able to have a capacity to absorb shock against droughts. It will have a capacity to handle large amounts of water. And a healthy functioning soil should have a buffer to help slow down or even resist fires, absurd fires in a landscape. So it adds to a climate resilience in this sense. And we already talked about clean water bodies. But again, it's like, okay, but what is soil? How is it made? How does it function? What is it? You know, these are kind of, it sounds like a simple question, but it's really something that is to discover. So for a long, long time, the definition of soil was it's a mixture of sand, silt, clay, water, air, and organic matter. And then, okay, well, there's also microbes in it, microorganisms, but it was kind of an inconsequential part of what a soil was, how a soil was defined. But as we're going to see, these microbes actually play a huge role in the very existence of soil. So it's not just a matrix, it's not just a blend of calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, sand. It's a living ecosystem, and the amount of organic matter in the soil is very much dependent on the kind of microbial life in the soil, as well as the plants, obviously. And the amount of nutrients available to the plants is going to be dependent on the microbes in the system. But very, very simply, I find it helps to show right off the bat what we mean by living soils. And it's hard to imagine the life beneath our feet. It sounds like this abstract concept, but this right here, we see swimming around, this is a nematode. This is a bacterial feeding nematode. Nematodes are predators of the soil ecosystem. We see tiny little circles of organisms. I'm going to bring this back. In the background, little guys bumbling around, swimming around, those are flagellates. These are also predators in the soil. This right here, that's a fungal hypha. That's a piece of a mushroom in the soil. This guy right here, well, I know it's hard to see, but there's little soil animals called amoeba in the soil ecosystem. They're kind of like the cows of the soil. They're also predators. They're grazing on bacteria, mostly, sometimes on fungi. But when we look in a soil, this is what we should see. We should see animals and micro insects and bacteria and fungi in it. We should see the soil animals moving around. The most populated ecosystem on the planet should be in the soil. In every teaspoon of soil, there should be millions of organisms in there, and not just bacteria. So this is very fundamentally what is meant by living soil or a living earth. When you hear concepts like the soil food web or soil ecology, we're talking about these organisms in the soil. Here's some other ones. And this is, when we talk about fertility of the soil, traditionally, again, fertility has been defined as how much certain amounts of nutrients and minerals you have in your soil. And while that is important, for me, to be fertile means to have a capacity to sexually reproduce. And minerals don't have a reproductive function. So when we're talking about soil fertility and the fertility of an ecosystem, and that abundant, diverse plant life is dependent on fertile soils, and abundant, diverse plant life feeds the rest of a food chain and the wildlife and the bugs and the bees and the birds. this fertility, we should be talking about soil organisms actually, and if they're present in the soil. These are just some videos of amoeba reproducing in the soil. Here the video is not so great, but you can see this. This is a different type of amoeba. It's a naked amoeba, and we'll see it soon. It's growing an arm this way. The video is terrible, I know. Whoops, I just paused it. And it's growing another arm this way, and it's kind of oozing its way into the soil, diving into soil aggregates, searching for bacteria. It's prey. Most of the time they're eating bacteria. Here's some fungi, fungal hypha. This is the, whoops, here's my computer doing its own thing again. Fungal hypha is the term for the little strands of mycelium. Mycelium is like the root system of a mushroom in the soil. These guys are incredibly important in soil ecosystems because they kind of look like branches, but they string together the soil. They're kind of like the rebar of the soil ecosystem, holding everything together and structuring the soil. And that structure allows for air, it allows for water, but it also creates these niche habitats for all the other organisms in the soil. That's just one of the functions that fungal hypha have in the soil kingdom. But very important. And we have nematodes. We saw a nematode swimming around. We saw a bacterial feeder. There's all kinds of nematodes in the soil, in a living soil. And it's an ecosystem. So they're all, each organism is there to, it's a soil food web. It's like the Lion King all over again. But that story of the circle of life begins underneath our feet in the soil. So there's some nematodes that prey on bacteria. There's some nematodes that prey on fungi. There's some nematodes that prey on other nematodes. They're predator nematodes. There's some nematodes that are parasitic root feeding nematodes. Those are not the ones we want to see. But nature has a check and balance for everything. And the predator nematodes, they like to prey on the parasitic nematodes. There's also a type of fungi. This video was taken by my friend Joe from Root Shoot Soils in British Columbia, of a fungi that grows with these lassos. And in those lassos, they put out into the soil juices that imitate the same kind of juices that a plant root would put into the soil. These juices of plant roots are called exudates, but for simplicity's sake, we'll call them plant juices. So they imitate those, and it attracts the nematode to it, thinking it's got a plant root. And once it swims through, it tightens around the nematode. It's a trap. And the nematode is there. It's strangled, and then that fungi feeds off the nematode. We're witnessing a murder right here. It's scandalous. There's all kinds of things happening beneath our feet. We are missing out on all kinds of sagas and dramas. This is a nematode in its egg about to hatch. We don't know what kind of nematode it is until it hatches. You know, the earth is literally alive. It's literally a living ecosystem. This is very much what I mean, what we mean, what people mean when we talk about that. And there's this concept of holobionts, which is the definition of that is an assemblage of a host and many other species living in and around it and on it, which together they form a ecological unit. And this is the definition off of Wikipedia, but I would argue, and many are arguing, that it's not very discrete at all. We are holobionts. We are part human cells, but the rest of our cells that make up our body, which is a significant amount, are microbial cells. And none of our bodily functions, the mechanisms that make the human body work, they don't work without these microbes. We know a lot about the role of microorganisms in the digestive tract, for example, and in our immune system, actually. So these are the kind of ways in which we are a living habitat as well. And the same thing goes for every living thing on Earth. All the wildlife, all the plants are holobionts. And plants have microbes growing all around their root system. There are microbes free floating in the soil. There are microbes living inside the plant. The plants are, we're finding out more and more, they're actually farming microbes. They're called endophytic microbes that spend part of their life cycle inside the plant. And then the plant at some point will spit them back out into the ecosystem and say, hey, I need more calcium. So why don't you go and fetch that? And then they'll go into the ecosystem and go back into the plant. And this cycle goes on and on. There's whatever organisms are around the plant in the soil will be all over the plant foliage and stems as well. So the biology and the health of the microbiome of a plant will begin in the soil and will be all over and inside the plant everywhere. So this is, oops, sorry, I have. And plants, they can only, they can only feed themselves. The only thing they can do is photosynthesis, right? They take sunlight, they take carbon, through a chemical process, they do photosynthesis. And what happens in photosynthesis isn't just the production of oxygen. That's a byproduct. What they do that to create sugars and send those sugars, these juices, these exudates, all throughout their body. And a lot of that goes into their root system because this is the currency they have to exchange with the microbes. Way at the beginning, when life was in the oceans and the surface of the planet was just rock. It wasn't Earth yet, it was rock. There was a symbiotic relationship that happened between a fungi and a cyanobacteria, an algae. They're not the same, but a photosynthetic organism. And they worked together, and that's how they colonized the rock and left the oceans. And this became all of the plant life and all of the animal life on Earth. So since the beginning, these relationships have been happening. And the plant, there's all the needs, they evolved to consume way more than just sunlight because of the relationships with fungi and then the other bacteria and then the other soil animals that evolved over time. Those organisms were able to go and release the minerals from the rocks and feed that to the plant. And so this allowed for a more diverse nutrition over time. And this is how plants feed themselves today. And so when I was talking about the earth systems and one of the things that they do is cycle nutrients, this is an example of it. The nutrient cycling, there's the different ways in which a plant feeds itself. These are microbial mechanisms and the plant teaming up with microbes in exchange for the sunlight energy that they're providing. The microbes need sugars and carbon that the plant can get far easier than they can. And that's the exchange, because the plant wants all the minerals and nutrients in the soil that they can't get on their own. We need a microbial metabolism to access those. So this is the exchange happening over time. And this is one of the functions of the soil food web, which is exactly what it means. It's the web of life in the soil, and it's a food chain. And this is what cycles nutrients around. This food chain also creates a healthy environment that suppresses the outrageous domination and spread of harmful pathogens and diseases. And a healthy microbiome will suppress the genetic expression of a virus, for example. So all of these microbes are required. It's a whole living ecosystem. And as you can see, it's the beginning of this web of life. All of the wildlife and biodiversity we see above the ground is interrelated with what is happening below the ground, whether that's through birds eating the insects and the worms and all the different spiders that will eat the various micro insects in the soil, or the mites and all this, and then the animals that feed off of those, and then the animals that feed off of those, and et cetera, and the list goes on, right? So they perform all this service, which is feeding the plant. It's the basis of the food web for the rest of life. This is how we support diverse plant diversity. It's how we suppress rampant disease. These organisms present in the soil and around the root systems of the plant also offer resilience to drastic heat changes. They decompose, resilience to drastically changing water conditions, all of these things. So to support biodiversity, to offer more resilience, and to do things in a way that is really not just working with nature, but we are working through nature in this way, which is, we need to go beyond being with it and not being part of it, but really just through it and participating in it in that way. I was going to show this, but I think I'm going to skip it. So soil and this soil ecosystem, which we grow our plants in, is literally built through time. So Earth came about by this association and this marriage between microbes and plants, and the plants growing and dying. And then eventually, through time, we had organisms of different kinds of fungi that came along that were able to decompose this organic matter. And this is how the humus and the soil was literally built over time because of this relationship between plants and microbes. Building soil and organic matter by breaking down the plants through time, as well as the microbes powered by the sun via the plants, breaking down and weathering the rocks in the earth, and all of this being pulled together by fungi and bacteria to create what we know as soil today. So this is like kind of the paradox, is that we can talk about soil, but soil can't really exist without plants, and it can't really exist without microbes. And it might be poetic and it might be romantic, but this is ecology. It is a story of interrelationships in this way. So it's hard. We could define one without the other, but you can see how it's really, when you think about it, it's hard to define one without the other. And all of life is intertwined in this way. So if we want to support biodiversity, we need to think about supporting it below the ground, above the ground, and the impact from the smallest bacteria to the highest predator. It's all kind of one story. So coming back to gardening then, there's fundamental things that we need to do to protect the life in soils, if they're there. If you want to know whether you've got a good amount of life in your soil, and if you have all of the right kinds of organisms, because you could have a bunch of life, but it's all bacteria. And that's not great, because bacteria only provide, there's all kinds of different bacteria that do different things, but there's way more that we need done in the soil ecosystem, roles and responsibilities, to be able to support plant life and cycle nutrients and ward off diseases and all of those things we talked about, that bacteria can't do. We need the fungi, we need the predators, etc. So a lot of farms that I have looked at, even organic ones, and I used to look at a lot of garden soils when I was like 10 years ago when I was starting this stuff. But I haven't in a while, because I work with farms. But it's surprising how, if you're not using compost and if you're not covering your plants, your soil at the end of the year, there's not much life happening. If you want to get your soil tested for all of the life, you can go to soilfoodweb.com, I guess, or .org, and you'll find a whole list of labs on there. And so you can send your garden soil to the nearest one to you. There's a couple in Canada. I'm one. I know there's one in BC, and there's probably several across Canada now. So you can go on that website and choose the one nearest to you. But there's fundamental things, like you never want to leave your soil bare and exposed to the elements. That is a no-no for life in the soil. If you think about it, soil is dark, and when the sun is out, man, that is absorbing all that heat, and it will dry out the soil. And we need organic matter, so either mulch or a living ground cover, to buffer that so it stays cooler. We have more moderate temperatures in the ground, and also to keep the moisture in the soil. The amoeba, the nematodes, the flagellates, those are all soil animals that live in the water film in the soil. So it's so important to always keep your soil covered for that reason. Also, if it's very windy, that will increase evaporation, and we need to hold the water in the soil. So that's why we say we need to mulch and cover the ground, especially before winter, and all throughout the year, because in the winter, underneath the snow in Canada and in all other countries like us, if we have dead brown organic matter and we have the microbes present, that is the fastest decomposition right on the planet. It's faster than in the tropics. It's underneath the snow in the wintertime. But the organisms need to be there. So if you want to build up your organic matter every year, build up your fertility, which is the microbial life, and the richness of nutrients they provide, you need to always have your soil covered. If you can cover it by something living, that's always best. At the end of the year, you need to make sure that there's dead brown stuff growing, or a living ground cover perennial that will keep going throughout the years. And what you can do is in the fall, you can give back to your soil by making a liquid compost, a compost extract. Now, there's a lot of talk about compost teas, and compost teas are amazing. But if you have a good compost, you can simply take compost, put it in an old stocking, and get non-chlorinated water or rainwater, or if you have chlorinated water, you want to let it evaporate for 24 hours. Fill up your bucket and take the compost and massage it vigorously in the water. You don't want to squish it, but you really want to massage it, knead it. And what you're trying to do is get the microbes in there to fall off the organic matter and into the water. And that is a compost extract. And if your compost is good, a compost extract should be enough. And you throw that on at the end of the year onto your garden with the organic matter, and you'll have a great decomposition rate. You'll grow fungi, which will help create a habitat for all the other organisms. You can use that at the beginning of the year as you're transplanting in your garden to put those microbes around the root systems of your plant so that your plant has more and more friends to make those associations with and be healthier every year. It's something you can do. Never disturb your soil unless you have no choice. So if you're every year tilling your soil, that fungi, those fungal hyphae that look like the long branches, who are the holding the structure of the soil, you're undoing their work every year. So if it's just this top surface of the soil, the 2 centimeters, because you got to sow carrots, that should be fine, especially if you're putting down compost or compost extract after. But deep disturbing year after year after year, unless you must, right? But doing this needlessly, this will harm the life in your soil, which will harm your plant life and the cascade of impacts from there. Having diverse amount of plants in your garden and around will feed a diversity of microbes in the soil. So if this is why partly why monocultures are bad, is because, you know, there's only one kind of plant juice to eat. And so the types of organisms that can grow in that soil and stay alive decline. And also the microbes in an ecosystem, the more different the plants are in terms of families and species, the more different microbiomes they're going to have around the root systems. And some people will say that plants will team up with each other and help each other out, but that's actually not true. It's their microbiomes. And the more different they are from one another, the more they are to help each other out and exchange nutrients. This one survives drought, and so it can help these guys out in drought, and all of that resilience that happens from there. Obviously, avoid using synthetic fertilizers and chemicals, and leave more than you take at the from your soils. Definitely a little bit of liquid kelp or liquid fish at the end of the year with your organic matter and your extract always does really great for soil life. So there's so much more we could talk about in this topic, but I've been talking for half an hour now and I'm going to stop. There's making composts. There's just so many more things. If you want to learn more, there's so much information on the internet for sure. So that's it for me for now. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop my screen share and open the floor for questions.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is remind everybody to please, if you have questions, I saw a couple go in the chat, but if you could put them all in the Q&A, because I just want to focus on the one spot to read the questions out. So if you want to just please type them in the Q&A, that would be great. Let's see what we've got so far. And I've got a couple of questions of my own, but I find this topic fascinating. Is the food cycler good for the environment? Is the dried compressed compost as good for the soil as standard compost? And just for everyone to know that food cycler is a new device that's out there that you can put your food waste in, and it speeds up, sort of like it breaks it up into small pieces. I'm not sure if it's true compost, but it certainly breaks it up into small pieces that you can then incorporate into your soil. So I'm not sure, Vivian, if you've got any thoughts on that.
Is that a question? Sorry, I wasn't.
Yeah.
The question is
the food cycler good for the environment? Is the dried compressed compost as good for the soil as standard compost? Because I'm assuming there are no microorganisms, or there are fewer microorganisms in this versus the compost made naturally, but
okay. So I don't know what it is, but yeah, I haven't heard of that. But what I can say, firstly, is it good for the environment? What is the life cycle of that product? Like, how many resources and how well is it made? You know, it's kind of the question of like, there's this great thing, but it's super polluting to make, right? So that's always the first question we need to ask with any product. And then secondly, anything that will stop food waste going into our landfills is good for the environment. As long as it is something that doesn't produce a lot of greenhouse gases in the process. And if we can recycle it, like nature has no waste. Everything is a resource. So if that final product, you can use it in your garden, it might not have microbes, but it probably has a lot of nutrients in there because there's nutrients in the food. The thing is with the microbes is the microbes are the one that metabolize that and make it accessible to the plant. So that's all I can really say. You can use it in combination with a compost.
I was going to say, if they have that, then perhaps they could also incorporate compost. The thing is, a lot of the time people have those because they have such a tiny garden and they can't compost at home, or they're in an apartment and they can't compost outside, and that's all they've got. So it's better than nothing, but I guess if they can get some living, healthy, natural compost as well to get those organisms in the soil, I suppose they could do both then, kind of thing.
Yeah, you can mix both, and you can vermicompost in an apartment vertically. Kids love it. Some kids are terrified of worms, but some kids love it. And you could buy some. And the picture that I had, I just want to share quickly for compost, because if you are making or buying compost, I want to go back to my screen share real quick. This right here. So this is a humic acid test. And basically, if you have good fungi in your compost and organisms like that, you should, so if you take like 1 part compost and 9 parts water in a jar, it doesn't have to be a test tube, and you shake it for 30 seconds to a minute, and then you leave it for 45 minutes. The color of your water should be chocolatey. If it is clear, there ain't no microbes in that compost. It's sterile. If it is golden, honey color, there's good bacteria in there and good bacterial predators, but there isn't much fungi and fungal predators. So that's just a quick test that you can do to know you got what you need in there.
That's awesome. That is a fantastic tip. See, I didn't know that. That's great. Thank you. There's a lot of questions. Let's see if we can motor through them. I'm particularly interested in the capacity of soil to sequester carbon. Can you briefly speak about this or point me to good resources?
Yeah, so trees and plants, all plants do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is taking sunlight and carbon. Hold on, let me go back here. I'm going back to, I have images in here. I'm going to explain it, but I'm also going to show this at the same time. Give me a sec here. Find the right thing. Here we go. So trees, this is a tree, but this is true with all plants, okay? They do photosynthesis. So they do it to feed themselves. But as a consequence, there is carbon sequestration happening. How is it stored in the soil? These blue bubbles that are coming in are the carbon molecules, okay? Carbon, sunlight, sequestered into the plants. So taken in by plants, photosynthesis. Then what happens to it? Well, it transforms into plant juices. These plant juices are put all over the plant's body, but a lot of them go into the soil. Why do they go into the soil? To feed and exchange with the soil microorganisms so that they will give the plants all the other nutrients they need that they can't access in the soil on their own without the microbes. So carbon sequestration, point one, is if we don't have this economy of demand of microbes in the soil living around the root systems, then that carbon is not going to stay in the soil system very long, right? And every living thing on the planet has a carbon to nitrogen ratio. The human body's carbon to nitrogen ratio is 30 carbon molecules for every nitrogen molecule. All of the microbes have a carbon to nitrogen ratio as well. So the more biomass, the more microbes in the soil, the more carbon that stays in the soil. Now, what happens when they die? When they die, they're either being eaten by another predator, which that carbon is then going into the next life form. If there's fungi in the soil, the fungi are decomposing it. And fungi, that what I just showed you with the humic acid test and that chocolatey brown water, those are humates. And what humates are, this is what makes soil healthy, rich soil, this 70% cacao brown, is the humification process. It's the humates that are there. And through the soil food web and the cycle of life in the soil, organic matter is decomposed. So either dead microbial bodies, dead plant life, and every structure, everything that's structure. So a leftover piece of straw on the ground or dead leaves, that's carbon. So if we have a mechanism to decompose that and keep it in the ground, that's how carbon stays in the soil. And once the fungi and the microbes, they'll keep eating the organic matter, cycling it around, but the smallest form the carbon can get is the humates. And that is by the fungi. The fungi will keep eating and cycling this over and over and over again until it cannot eat it and decompose it and re-eat it anymore. And it spits out a humate. And that is very condensed carbon. And this is carbon sequestration in the soil. But we need soil life to do that. So while it is very important to focus on methods to reduce emissions and sequester carbon, it's more important to focus on supporting biodiversity, because that is how the carbon will be sequestered in the ground. I don't know if that makes sense.
Great, yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. The next question actually is to do with farmers, and I'm going to send you guys a link in the follow-up email with the Soil Food Web link that Vivian mentioned before. There's some great videos talking about all the incredible success farmers are having with increasing yields and saving increased profits and whatnot, and reducing fertilizers. So Vivian, they're saying, are you having any success in convincing farmers, not all, to stop killing the soil with pesticides and artificial fertilizers?
Yeah. Well, I try not to convince anybody of anything. I just start talking. That's why I educate, and I try to offer accessible education, because there's no selling that needs to happen. Once people understand the impact that artificial fertilizers have on the microbes and therefore the impact on the plant, their crop, and how that impacts them and their bank accounts, it's usually a pretty convincing move to start reducing and eventually get to as little or none, if if they can. So usually farmers are very smart people, and it's tough because they're coming from generations of things being done one way, and we just didn't know that it was not okay. They're not evil for using pesticides. They just didn't know otherwise. And now there's so many people coming to them. Every product person says that their product works, and everybody's trying to sell them everything. And so it's hard for them to know what's true and what's not true. But this approach of soil ecology and living soils, the soil food web, soil regeneration, soil life is getting more and more of a good rap from the farmers who are now talking about it to other farmers. And when farmers talk about it, farmers listen, because I'm not a farmer. I'm an ecologist. So I don't know what it's like to take that risk with my company, with my business and my way of living, my way of supporting my family, my kids, all of that. I don't have that same risk. But when a farmer talks about it, they listen. So there's more and more people coming around to it. There's the question of, well, what if I need to use something harmful every now and then, just as like an insurance policy? And it's kind of like, well, if you are into natural health and you try to do everything the most natural way possible, but then you get into a situation where if you don't take an antibiotic, you're in trouble. It's kind of like that in agriculture. So I think there needs to definitely need to push for more natural ways of being. We also need to have empathy for people in those kind of situations like that.
But it sounds like there's a good response, and things are working well in terms of them understanding and shifting. So that's great.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Farmers are definitely shifting. Yeah.
Good. I see we've got about 31 questions and we're nearly at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to try to fire through a bunch of these and see how far we can get. We've got, are root feeding nematodes feeding the roots, or are they feeding on the roots?
They're sucking the plant juices out of the roots.
Okay. And then your opinion about urban grassy areas and garden lawns?
I think we need less monoculture and more diversity so that we can support our urban and suburban wildlife. Lawns were a way of demonstrating wealth back in the day, that they didn't need to use their space to grow food because that's how wealthy we were. So it's kind of like, it was kind of the mark of a king or a lord or a, yeah. So, and it became, this trend. But I think if we can turn our lawns into landscapes that support biodiversity, living soils, and all the rest, obviously, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. And then when applying compost extract, do you dilute it? And if so, how much?
I use it straight. Farmers use it straight.
So then making a compost extract, how much water to how much compost what are your proportions initially when you make it and then use it straight?
So it depends on the quality of your compost. With my compost, for every 20-liter bucket, we're using 3 cups of compost. Again, that like chocolatey brown humates color, you want that. That's the color you want. So use as much compost until you get that, once it's settled a bit too, because you might get that at the beginning, but then in the end, all the particular matter goes down and then you don't have it really. Anyways.
Okay, thanks. Someone's asking, what about leaving some soil bare for bees? Because a lot of our bees are ground nesters. And so, for instance, mulch can be very hard if it's the rough, large tipped kind. If it's super fine, it may not be quite as bad. But then you're talking also about planting plants together. So there will be bare soil below the plants, just the soil is protected. So I'm not sure if that's the option that we're going for here.
Yeah, this is like the diverse landscape kind of thing. If you have living plants covering the ground and they die back a bit in the fall and they'll come back, that will usually leave space for bees to get in and do their thing.
And some bees, they nest in like sandy areas, which are like pathways and edges anyway. So I guess it's an imbalance there because there's so many different species too. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay. What did you suggest adding to the soil besides compost? Was it fish meal?
Oh, I said fish hydrolysate actually, which is a cold pressed fish leftover juice from the fishing industry. Which I'm just going to say this now. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency has stopped renewing the licenses for all marine products in agriculture. They did this in 2020, kind of hush hush. And this is really bad news for those farmers who are needing alternatives to switch their fertilizers, their nitrogen sources, for organic farmers, for ways of fertilizing our plants that don't harm the microbes, but feed the microbes and the biodiversity below the ground. So that's liquid kelp, liquid fish products. So sound the alarms. That can't happen because, also what are we going to do with all that waste? We're just going to put it in landfill? Like, no. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Another one, how will jumping worms, which are spreading across Canada, impact soil?
So it's yet to be seen. I think they're definitely going to have an impact on soil biodiversity because worms tend to eat microbes. They're not actually eating organic matter. And they might be eating them faster than they can replenish themselves. So it's yet to be seen.
And I know we had a speaker, I think like Heather Holmes, speaking before about how be careful with buying mulch because that actually can, depending on the kind of mulch you buy, actually, spread them around too. So like use your own leaves when you can. And yeah, okay, thank you. Someone says, my soil has been left completely untouched and uncovered for about 7 years now. How do I start giving it life back?
How do you start giving it some love? Plant a diverse cover crop in there and use compost as a top dress. Throw down some liquid compost extract, and at the end of the year, you want to leave that mulch, that dead layer of plants there, and throw down again some liquid extract and just kind of help build the organic matter. If it's really compacted, you might want to go in there with a broad fork before you seed. But make sure you use at least 4 different types of plants, plant species, or even better, plant families in that mix.
Okay, great. And if I apply compost to the top of my garden bed, should I mix it into the subsoil? In other words, don't till, but just gently mixing it in a little bit.
If you're starting a new garden and you're buying black earth, which we should all avoid doing as much as possible, but if that's what you're doing, mixing in compost at the beginning is probably a good idea. Or if you have garden soil that is very kind of gray or doesn't have that dark color kind of richness, maybe at the beginning you can be mixing in organic matter, but as a long-term strategy for supporting soil life, that's not something you want to do.
Okay, I'm actually going to throw a quick question in before the next one and say, when people want to add compost to their gardens, I know some nurseries, well, many nurseries and other places sell bagged compost. Am I correct in assuming that if there's no holes in it, that it could suffocate the microorganisms and therefore you're not really getting the full bang for your buck kind of thing? Okay, because that just came to me recently and it's like, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, unless it was like freshly bagged. But we sell our compost in reused like jute bags from animal feed, from like chicken feed, kind of thing. Kind of like coffee grain bags, the big ones. So we do it in that.
It's porous so they can breathe.
Air exchange, exactly. Yeah.
Perfect, thanks. Our community garden covers the soil with plastic over the winter. Is that beneficial other than keeping weeds out?
Definitely keeps weeds out. If you live in a very dry area, it could help keep moisture in. You want to make sure there's air exchange. But most importantly, the thing is if you're trying to build up a soil biodiversity, especially fungal life, the winter is the time to build up that life, to build up the fungi by leaving organic matter and letting the snow hit it and the decomposition that will happen over the winter and all that rich nutrient that will be added to your soils in the spring. What I tend to do is in the fall, I'll make sure that there's, my soil is not bare. I'll put an extract down. I'll usually put some kind of whatever I've got. We work with somebody who makes fermented liquid seaweed. So I always have some left over that I haven't sold or whatever. I'll throw that down to give back. And then early spring, like as soon as the snow melts or even before it's done melting, then I'll go cover the garden so that I don't have weeds. Just to kind of, I use tarps because we have like lots of huge tarps. It's not as great as plastic in terms of what the tarps have to be dark. They can't be white and they can't be green. They've got to be at least dark blue or black. That's what I've noticed. But that's kind of my compromise that I've done so that I don't have crazy amounts of weeds to deal with.
Great, thank you. Okay, so will just spreading homemade compost work for the soil as well as making the tea? Also, once the tea is made, do you put the compost tea leaves back into the compost pile or is it done and has to be discarded?
Sorry, can you restart the question? I missed the first.
Sure. Will just spreading homemade compost work for the soil as well as making the tea?
So compost works on the surface for increasing organic matter and the microbes that are on the surface. The cool thing about making extract, or if you want to make tea, it's harder to do. It's easier to screw up, but it's great. It works really well. It's a liquid, so we can get it into the profile of the soil. And we need a lot less compost when you're making a liquid, then it will cover much more surface area than with compost. Okay. But they're really like two different things. One is staying on the surface, and one you can put it on the surface of your plant, around your roots. It can go down. So I'd say both. It's not.
And when you make compost tea, do you put the organic matter that made the compost tea back into the compost pile, or? Yep. Okay. Yep. Great. And then when you're making compost tea, is there a length of time before you start suffocating the organisms when they're underwater? Like, does it matter how long? So what are you aiming for? Like leave it there for 24 hours, but no longer kind of thing, or how?
No. So, okay. What I described in this webinar was compost extract, right? Compost tea is a similar thing where we're getting the microbes in the water. So you start off with an extract. And then you're turning on an air bubbler, you're adding certain ingredients to the water, and then you're going to be multiplying some of the organisms and you're going to be activating maybe a bunch of dormant organisms that were in your compost. And you're doing that for 24 hours. You do not want to leave your compost in. We used to make compost tea by putting the compost bag in the water and letting it for 6 hours, just letting the microbes. But in that 6 hours, you can develop anaerobic organisms, so organisms that we don't want.
Mm.
That's why we start by simply making an extract, which is shake the microbes into the water, take the compost out, and then start your tea brewing process.
Okay, so it's all pretty quick then doing that. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Good. I'm particularly interested in how to eliminate non-organic matter from garden soil. Many nurseries continue to use small bits of styrofoam in their soil. Do you have a trick to remove this? I think they're referring maybe to perlite.
Like physically remove it, manually remove it, or
because often the soil that you buy will have different bits of the white bits, and sometimes even have the little green pellets of
yeah,
or whatnot. And yeah,
how do we manually take them out?
do you have a trick to getting them out? I don't. I have to take them out if I take it.
Green, sift it out.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah. And how do earthworms fit into the web? Well, you've kind of talked about it, how they kind of predate on a lot of these organisms. Then
earthworms are not native to here. They're an invasive species. They fit in, but they do fit in. It's just, there's some worms that are eating things faster than we know that they can come back. But earthworms, they feed on the soil organisms that are decomposing organic matter. And so they'll often be in places where there's a lot of organic matter. And that's why we think they're eating organic matter, but they're not. And they do leave really rich trails of soil behind, or vermicompost behind. And that vermicompost does have a lot of organisms in it and a lot of spores. So again, this is like, I think most worms are fine. It's just there's these like super ninja snake worms that are crazy, and we just don't know what the impact is going to be. But regular earthworms seem to fit in nice and slow and fine.
Thanks. I'm going to try to wrap it up soon because we're at 8:07 now. I'm working on an art science project on regenerative agriculture. I would like to find a soil scientist to work with me. I'm in Ottawa. Can you recommend a way to find this person? And again, also FYI, I mean, if anyone does need to, approach Vivian for her consulting services, please, feel free to afterwards. But I'm not sure if this is something that you have any information on.
Well, and you can write me an email, tell me more about your project. And if I can't be involved, I'll refer you to someone who might be interested.
Thank you.
I'll try to.
Great. Could you recommend a soil pH tester, and what naturals are best to balance the soil to balance the pH?
And what is?
Can you recommend a soil pH tester, and what naturals are best to balance the soil to balance the pH?
I cannot recommend a pH tester.
Okay.
Just because I couldn't recommend one to you. I don't work with them. This is like a trick question. We've just opened a rabbit hole, but quickly, how do I answer this? Balancing soil pH, believe it or not, is a question of having a good percentage organic matter and the right microbiome around your root system. Active microbes have glues around their bodies, kind of like how active people sweat. Those glues have a certain pH. So this is influencing the pH environment around a root system, is who is present around the root system, because things like that we use, like limestone and stuff like that, they will change your pH, but for 2-3 weeks, and then things will go out of whack again. So they do work for very short term, but they also last short term. And the long-term best thing to do to balance out your soil is to get your percentage organic matter and higher, and to have more soil organisms around your root system, and your plant will help create its own pH around its root system.
Great, thanks. Someone's asking, is urine good for the soil? Because again, I've also heard people say that's can be beneficial. And also, I'd like to ask, what do you think about aged sheep manure? Very organic, beautifully made sheep manure. What do you think of either of those?
Composted, aged, decomposed manure from well-fed animals.
Loved, organic, beautifully raised animals, yes.
Is amazing for the soil. It's amazing for the plants. Raw manure in small amounts is great. It's just people tend to use too much of it, and the animals that are not really fed that well, this will have a negative impact on the biology, which will impact your plants. But aged, beautiful manure, very great for gardening. Yeah,
I've seen good results. But does it have all of the different organisms that you're talking about, or is it imbalanced in any way, or do you know if it's?
That would depend on how much bedding, like how much bedding manure was in there.
Yeah.
It kind of depends.
Okay. Well, we can get to the urine. How about urine for the soil?
Well, it's free.
Diluted urine too. Strong undiluted urine, I think, can burn and it.
Yeah. So it's a source of nitrogen. It's a source of nitrogen. Urine has been part of the cycle of nutrients on planet Earth forever. Animals just peeing on the ground. So again, it's about dosage and dilution.
Okay. One person's saying they're 100% plant-based, so all their scraps are that way inclined. Is that sufficient to making healthy compost, or do they need to add something to it? So mostly vegetables, fruits, legumes, grains, some oil.
So like vegan compost?
Pretty much, yeah.
Again, it depends. It depends, like any compost, vegan or not. Its goodness will depend on, most composts don't have enough carbon in it. Okay, there's too many green things, or there's too much manure, or there's too many food scraps, there's too much grass, and not enough dead brown material. So that's leaves or wood chips or straw. Be careful because there's a lot of glyphosate on straw. Glyphosate will feed bacteria, but it might be harmful for fungi. So there's just a cardboard is a carbon source. So there's generally, vegan or not vegan, there's generally not enough carbon in compost. And if you have a balanced recipe, vegan compost should be fine. The thing is about using animal manure is that there's some organisms, it's kind of like how vermicompost, the worms are pooping out all of these great organisms. The cows are too. The sheep are too. Chickens, they are, but it's just super powerful, and you got to make sure those chickens are eating good things. You don't want to use too much. But there's certain organisms in the soil and certain kinds of fungi that their spores won't germinate unless they've been through a digestive tract of an animal, for example. So, I mean, you can make good you can make good vegan compost for sure. It depends on your ingredients. And like if you're adding things like biodynamic plant ferments in there, you'll get some interesting stuff. But yeah, it kind of depends on your ingredients, the mix, the ratio of your ingredients. Is there enough water? How good is your process? Is it stinking? Are you not turning it? Like there's so many, it depends. But yeah, vegan compost can be nice. I like using manures. That's just because I have them, and it's just what I like. But yeah, you can make vegan compost pretty decent.
And even in backyard composters, you have your nitrogen ingredients of the fruits and vegetables, etc. And then I would always save some dried leaves and I would always layer them so they had the right balance of carbon to nitrogen ratio for the organisms. And then that would be great. And then if I want to add manure extra, then that's there.
And if you want a compost that's going to heat up and kill off pathogens, diseases, and seeds, like weed seeds, usually we have a hard time achieving that with vegan composts. That's, I would say, the one for sure hard thing to do with plant-based composts, because manures and urines and animal waste products are so high nitrogen that they really get the temperature cranking, and it's in between temperatures of 55 to 6 to 55 to above 55 degrees Celsius that we're killing off pathogens, diseases, and we're making sure weed seeds aren't viable. And then of course there's like, to not kill the good things, we don't want to go too high. So the best is between 55 to 65 degrees Celsius. But sometimes it can be hard to get those temperatures of vegan compost and to sustain them long enough. So we need those temperatures for 3 days in a row to do that job. And then every time you turn the pile, we need that to repeat itself for 3 to 5 times. So some with like beer mash, for example, is a way to do it with vegan compost. So leftover spent grain from breweries, but it's like, and then, so again, it's really like mastering that and getting the right balance going.
Okay, the thing with compost, it can be as simple and basic as you need to be, but it can be so intricate to get it just right and refine it. So this is fascinating.
As much an art as it is a science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Should we just ask one more question? Because it's gone quarter past. And I know people have been really appreciating this wonderful information. So someone's asking, I plant a garden every year and I try to move the different crops around each year. For example, I don't put peas in the same spot each year. But it would be very hard to plant things in areas that aren't tilled. The soil does get hard where I walk between the rows. So I do till my garden each year. Do you suggest that I keep the same layout each year and just plant different veggies in different rows?
Yeah, well, it might be just easier for you to do it that way too. But generally, yeah, maybe try that out, is just rotate the plants, but not rotate the garden beds themselves.
Yeah, keep the pathways the same. So that gets compacted fine and it mulch it, yes, but the actual beds themselves don't get compacted and therefore they probably won't need the tilling then, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Perfect. Well, there are a bunch more questions and I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. There's been such a fantastic interest and I am so extremely grateful for everyone joining in and participating, their feedback. Some people have shared some awesome ideas and links as well in the chat, so that's great. Thank you. And of course, Vivian, you're a fountain of knowledge and your enthusiasm has just been delightful. And I know people have been really picking up on that and appreciating it. So thank you very much from me and all of us. And yeah, I wish you very well with your business. And I'm so excited to hear you are helping all these people return to that natural way of being, which is, wonderful for the land. We don't need to worry about those scaremongers saying, 60 years of farming left if we return to this way of partnering with nature the way it was intended. So thank you.
Yeah, there's so much to look forward to. Regenerating our planet is a creative process, and we need to have fun with it and have faith that we're able to do it. We're of this earth as well, and there's so many solutions and so much to be positive and grateful for. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you everybody for coming to listen to this. And yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Happy gardening.
And you guys watch out for a follow-up email soon. So
yeah.
thank you very much. Take care.
Right. You too. Bye.
Everybody.